A small girl with perfect pitch hums low in the plantation kitchen while steam rises and dogs go quiet at her voice. Slaves are too black for me, the mistress declares as a proud man enters the parlor and the auction papers are drawn before winter comes. But when floodwaters rise and the household must follow her lantern to safety, this child discovers something hidden in the family Bible's margin, a manumission clause, written in graphite, torn away by trembling hands. Storm winds howl, courthouse bells ring. A forged seal glints pale blue in the afternoon sun, while the real one waits iron blue and true. Will a 9-year-old's voice be strong enough to speak truth when the crowd gathers? Can perfect pitch sing justice into the light, or will lies drown out freedom's song forever? The dogs went quiet when Liddy hummed. She stood at the kitchen table in the grey hour before dawn, steam rising from herb water in the kettle, her voice low and steady as creek water. The 2-yard dogs, Buster and May, dropped their heads to their paws by the door, ears soft, watching her with amber eyes that held no threat. "Child's got a gift. Cook," Mabel said, kneading ash bread on the floured board. "Dogs know music same as people do." Liddy touched the ribbon at her wrist, checking the knot. Pale blue silk, worn soft from handling, tied in a loop her mama had taught her before she died. The knot felt different this morning, looser, like it might slip. Omens lived in small things. Mama had taught her that too. Steam fogged the window glass. Outside, the river caught the first light like scales on a fish, and somewhere in the fields, a rooster called. The plantation stretched along the water main house, white as a courthouse, quarters in neat rows, barns and sheds, and the landing where boats tied up to load cotton when the harvest came good. "Carry this tray to Miss Aurelia," Mabel said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Parlour tea for the ladies. Mind you don't rattle the cups." Liddy lifted the silver tray, testing its weight. Cups and saucers, a sugar bowl with a tiny spoon, cream in a white pitcher that caught the lamplight. Her reflection wavered in the teapot's curve, 9 years old, small for her age, dark eyes that noticed everything. The ribbon's knot had shifted again. She felt it without looking. She stepped into the bright hall, bare feet silent on polished boards. Voices drifted from the parlor, ladies from town, come to visit Miss Aurelia Vale, who was sister-in-law to Eliza Whitfield and spoke her mind on every subject under heaven. The hall smelled of beeswax and cut flowers, and morning light slanted through tall windows, making squares of gold on the floor. The parlor doors stood open. Through them, Liddy saw women in silk dresses arranged on chairs like flowers in a garden, Miss Aurelia at the center, hands moving as she talked, her voice sharp and sure. "Proper household requires standards," Aurelia was saying. "You must know your people's place, or chaos follows. I tell Eliza this daily." Liddy paused at the threshold, tray balanced, waiting for the right moment to enter. She'd learned to be still, to listen, to step light as a cat when grown folks were talking. "Some families are too permissive," one of the ladies said, Mrs. Carver, from the big house downriver, her voice pinched with judgment. "Slaves grow bold when rules grow soft." Aurelia laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Indeed they do. Slaves are too black for me, too black to trust with liberties. I've seen what happens when you give them airs. They forget themselves entirely." The other ladies murmured agreement, teacups clinking. Liddy felt her stomach tighten. She knew the words weren't meant for her ears, but she stood there anyway, tray growing heavier in her hands. That's when the double doors at the parlor's far end swung open. Josiah stepped through, carrying a cedar chest on his shoulder. He was tall, maybe 25 years old, with broad shoulders and careful hands. His shirt was clean, his pants mended neat. But it was his bearing that changed the room, the way he walked with his back straight, the way his eyes met every gaze without bowing. The ladies fell silent. Even Miss Aurelia's teacup froze halfway to her lips. Josiah set the chest down by the window, the wood settling with a soft thump. He straightened, nodded to the ladies with quiet courtesy, and waited for instruction. His hands hung loose at his sides, no tremor in them, no hurry to duck his head or shuffle his feet. The silence stretched until it hummed like a plucked wire. "Thank you," Eliza Whitfield said from her chair by the fireplace. Young widow, pale and thin, she'd taken sick, often since her husband died the winter before. Her voice came soft, barely strong enough to cross the room. "You may go." but Josiah didn't move immediately. His eyes found Liddy at the doorway, holding her tray, and something passed between them, a look of recognition, maybe, or understanding. He nodded to her, just barely, like he was acknowledging her presence as something that mattered. Aurelia's face went red as a coal ember. She set her teacup down hard, the china ringing. "Pike," she called toward the hallway. "Pike, attend me." The overseer appeared thin man with pale eyes and ink stains on his fingers, always carrying papers, always watching. He stepped into the parlor, hat in hand, eyes moving from Aurelia to Josiah and back. "Yes, ma'am. See that this one is sold before winter," Aurelia said, pointing at Josiah with her fan. "I won't have such boldness in a proper household. Too black for me, as I said. Arrange the auction." Pike's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Yes, ma'am. I'll see to the papers." Josiah stood still through it all, face calm as pond water. He looked at Pike, then at Aurelia, then at Eliza, who had pressed a hand to her chest and was breathing shallow, quick breaths. "Ma'am," Josiah said to Eliza, voice low and careful, "you need anything before I go?" Eliza shook her head, but Liddy saw how her fingers trembled against the chair arm. The lady was having one of her spells, the kind where her breath came too fast and her face went white as paper. "Go," Pike said, stepping toward Josiah. "Back to the fields." Josiah nodded once, picked up his hat from where he'd set it by the chest, and walked toward the door. As he passed Liddy, he slowed just enough to steady a wobbling candlestick on the side table with one finger. The candle flame guttered but held. "Thank you, miss," he said to her, quiet as a whisper. Then he was gone, boots echoing on the hall boards. The ladies began talking again, voices nervous and bright, but Liddy wasn't listening anymore. She was watching Eliza, who was trying to fan herself with a trembling hand, trying to slow her breathing and failing. The spell was coming full now, the kind that sometimes laid her up for days. "Mrs. Whitfield," Liddy said, stepping into the room. "You want some water?" Aurelia waved her hand dismissive. "Child, put the tray down and fetch Dr. Thorne." "Mrs. Whitfield requires attendance." But Liddy was already moving, setting the tray on the table, then kneeling beside Eliza's chair. She'd seen these spells before, knew how they started and how they ended. Sometimes they ended badly. "Breathe like this," she said, showing Eliza a slow, steady pattern. "In, hold, out, hold." Eliza tried to follow, her eyes fixed on Liddy's face. The other ladies watched with a mix of confusion and distaste, a slave child giving instruction to their hostess. "Really?" Aurelia said. "The presumption—" "Let her," Eliza gasped. "She helps." And slowly, breath by breath, the spell eased. Color came back to Eliza's cheeks. Her hands stopped shaking. The ladies murmured among themselves, not sure what they'd witnessed. Dr. Thorne arrived 20 minutes later, a heavy man with kind eyes and a leather bag that smelled of camphor and tobacco. He checked Eliza's pulse, listened to her heart, and pronounced her improved but in need of rest. "Child," he said to Liddy as they walked toward his back room to fetch a tonic. "Who taught you that breathing pattern?" "My mama," Liddy said, "before she died. She said breath's the first medicine and the last." The doctor's room was lined with jars and bottles, labels written in spidery script. He mixed something that smelled bitter and sharp, pouring it into a small brown bottle. As he worked, Liddy read the labels, sounding out words she'd learned from the hymnal and the Bible. One label caught her eye. "Respira ordinatim." She said the words aloud, testing their shape. Dr. Thorne looked up, surprised. "You read Latin?" "Some words," Liddy said. "This one means breathe steady." "Near enough. Breathe regularly, in proper order." He corked the bottle and handed it to her. "Give Mrs. Whitfield 3 drops in, water when the spells come, and keep showing her that pattern you used." Walking back to the parlor, Liddy thought about Josiah and the way he'd steadied the candle, the way he'd thanked her like she was someone who mattered. She thought about Pike's pale eyes and the papers he'd mentioned, about auctions and winter coming. Most of all, she thought about the ribbon at her wrist and the way its knot kept shifting, like something was trying to work loose. The ladies were taking their leave when she returned, rustling in silk and murmuring about the day's excitement. Aurelia kissed Eliza's cheek and spoke low in her ear words Liddy couldn't catch, but that made Eliza flinch. "Keep that bottle close," Eliza whispered to Liddy when they were alone. "There's supper tonight, and I fear I'll need steadying." Outside, the yard dogs started barking. Something had stirred them up. Liddy hummed low, the same tune she'd used at daybreak, and their voices broke apart like smoke in wind. The ribbon's knot had shifted again. This time, she retied it careful, making it strong. Evening came with lamplight and the smell of ham and cornbread from the kitchen. The dining room table stretched long under the chandelier, set with the good china and silver that caught the light like small suns. All the dinner guests had come, neighbors and friends, drawn by Aurelia's invitation and the promise of good food and gossip. Liddy stood in the corner by the sideboard, ready to refill water glasses or fetch what was needed. She'd changed into her good dress blue cotton with white trim, saved for company dinners. The ribbon at her wrist looked bright against the dark fabric. Eliza sat at the head of the table, pale but upright, the breathing pattern Liddy had taught her helping her keep steady. Aurelia held court from the side, her voice carrying over the clatter of forks and the low murmur of conversation. "And I told Pike to arrange it promptly," she was saying. "Before the new year, certainly. Some slaves require firm handling, and that one has altogether too much pride for his station." Mrs. Carver nodded knowingly. "Pride in a slave is like rot in an apple. It spreads if not cut out." "Precisely." Aurelia's voice rose, pleased to have an audience. She lifted her wineglass, the red liquid catching the candlelight. "Slaves are too black for me, too black to trust with comfort. Give them ease, and they grow presumptuous. Better to remind them of their place." Several guests murmured agreement. The conversation turned to other topics, the weather, the cotton market, rumors of trouble up in Virginia. But Liddy felt the words settling in her stomach like stones. That's when the door opened and Josiah entered, carrying a water pitcher to refill the sideboard. He moved quiet and careful, but every eye in the room found him. Conversation stuttered and died. He was clean and neat, his shirt pressed, his movements respectful, but there was no bowing in his shoulders, no shuffling in his step. He poured water into the crystal pitcher with steady hands, set the empty vessel aside, and prepared to leave. "Wait," Aurelia said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Turn around." Josiah turned, meeting her gaze direct. "Now there's a perfect example," Aurelia said to her guests, as if Josiah weren't standing 3 feet away. "Look at that bearing. Look at those eyes. Too proud by half. This is exactly what I meant about presumption." The guests stared. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, a few nodding along with Aurelia's words. Josiah stood still through it all, hands at his sides, breathing slow and even. Liddy felt her own breath coming quick and tight. She looked at Eliza, who was gripping her napkin with white knuckles, her face pale again. "Pike assures me the New Year auction will handle this matter," Aurelia continued. "Some slaves require selling to break their spirit. It's a kindness, really teaching them proper humility." That's when Eliza began to sway in her chair. Liddy moved without thinking, crossing to kneel beside her mistress. The breathing spell was coming hard. Liddy could see it in the quick flutter of pulse at Eliza's throat, the way her lips parted for air that wouldn't come deep enough. "Breathe with me," Liddy whispered, her voice too low for the guests to hear clearly. She began the pattern, counting slow and steady. In, hold, out, hold. The room had gone silent, watching this strange tableau. A slave child coaching a white woman's breath, while another slave stood waiting for dismissal, all of it happening at a dinner table where the wine still sparkled in crystal glasses. Eliza's breathing slowly steadied. Color came back to her cheeks. She nodded to Liddy, a small, grateful gesture. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. Josiah stepped forward, concern clear in his face. "Ma'am, you need anything else? Water? Should I fetch the doctor?" "No," Eliza said, finding her voice. I'm much better. Thank you." Aurelia's face had gone dark with displeasure. "This display is quite unnecessary. Josiah, you're dismissed. Liddy, return to your position." But something had shifted in the room. The guests were looking at Josiah with new eyes, seeing not just a slave, but a man who showed genuine concern for a sick woman's welfare. They were looking at Liddy too, recognizing something in her calm competence that didn't fit their expectations. "Mrs. Carver cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should speak of other matters." "Indeed," said Judge Thornton, an elderly man with a white beard. "The child seems to have a gift for nursing, and the fellow shows proper concern for his mistress's health." Aurelia's wineglass struck the table harder than necessary. "Gifts and concern are all very well, but they don't change the fundamental nature of the situation. Order must be maintained." But Liddy heard something new in her voice, a note of uncertainty, like a string gone slightly out of tune. The guests were not responding as Aurelia had expected. Some looked troubled, others thoughtful. The mood had changed. Josiah bowed his head respectfully. "Begging your pardon, I'll return to quarters now." He met Liddy's eyes again as he turned to go. This time she saw something there. She recognized gratitude and a kind of quiet determination, like he was making a decision about something. After he left, conversation resumed, but it stayed careful and shallow. Nobody mentioned auctions again. When the evening finally ended and the guests took their leave, Aurelia kissed Eliza's cheek with lips pressed thin. "We'll discuss your household management tomorrow," she said. "Some matters require private conversation." After everyone was gone, Liddy helped clear the table while Eliza sat in her chair, breathing the steady pattern, staring into the dying fire. "Liddy," Eliza said finally. "Come here, child." Liddy approached, carrying the last of the water glasses. "That man Josiah, how long has he been with us?" "Since spring, ma'am. Came from the Hendricks place when they sold off after the master died." Eliza nodded slowly. "And you've spoken with him?" "Some," Liddy said carefully. "He's always respectful, helps with heavy lifting when needed." "Yes," Eliza said. "I've noticed." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire settle into coals. Aurelia means to have her way about the auction. Liddy said nothing, but her hand found the ribbon at her wrist. The knot felt solid now, properly tied. Strong enough to hold whatever weight might test it. "I've delayed it until after storm season," Eliza continued. "But come winter." She didn't finish the thought. Outside, wind picked up in the trees. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled low. Storm season wasn't over yet. There might still be time for something to change, some other current to shift the course of things. "Ma'am," Liddy said carefully, "that breathing pattern, it's just like singing. Finding the right rhythm, the right pitch. Everything's got its natural tune, if you listen close enough." Eliza looked at her with tired eyes. "What's the tune for justice, child?" Liddy didn't know the answer, but as she carried the glasses to the kitchen, she found herself humming low, not the dog-quieting tune from morning, but something else. Something that felt like a hymn without words, a song that was still learning its own melody. The ribbon at her wrist caught the last of the firelight as she walked, a pale blue thread holding steady against whatever darkness was coming. The hymn came to Liddy in church on Sunday morning, buried in a verse about valleys and still waters. But when she listened close, really close, the words mapped something else entirely: ferry poles and cypress knees, creek bends and wagon trails, a route through the back country that might lead a careful traveler to the county seat without using the main roads. She sat in the rear pew of Mount Olive Baptist, where the enslaved folks gathered for services when Master Jenkins preached to them special on Sundays. The small wooden church smelled of pine sap and old hymnals, and morning light slanted through windows that needed washing. "Let us sing number 47, Master Jenkins called from the pulpit, his voice carrying easy authority. "Guide me through the valley." Liddy opened her hymnal, finding the page by memory more than sight. The congregation rose around her, voices lifting in harmony that made the walls seem to breathe. "Guide me through the valley, past the standing stones, where the cypress marks the crossing, and the old trail bends. Ferry pole and wagon wheel, count them as you go. Safe harbor waits beyond the bend, where friendly lamplight glows." Other folks sang the words as comfort and promise, but Liddy heard geography: cypress at creek crossings, ferry poles marking shallow water, wagon trails that bent around the hill country toward town. She'd learned to read maps in the big house, helping sort papers for Eliza sometimes, and the hymn was laying out a route clear as ink on paper. The back way to Millfield, where the county courthouse sat with its records and seals and legal proceedings. She memorized every verse while the congregation swayed and sang. 20 minutes later, walking back toward the plantation with the other workers, she hummed the tune under her breath and felt the route settling in her memory like a well-learned lesson. That's when she noticed Pike. He stood by the quarters, talking low with two men she didn't recognize patrollers. By their look. Men who rode the roads at night, checking passes and asking questions. They wore badges pinned to their coats and carried clubs at their belts, and their horses stamped restless in the dust. "Papers need updating," one was saying as Liddy passed near enough to hear. "New regulations from Richmond. Extra caution with the ones that might run." Pike nodded, producing a leather folder from his coat. "Everything's in order. See for yourself." But Liddy was close enough now to glimpse the papers as Pike spread them on a wooden crate, and something was wrong with the seal. The wax was pale blue instead of iron blue, and the letter R in the county clerk's stamp had the wrong serif, a little curled tail where it should have been straight. She'd seen the real seal on legal papers in Eliza's desk, helping sort correspondence. This one was close, but not right. Her perfect memory caught and held the details like a photograph. Wrong blue, wrong letter, wrong enough to matter. "All seems proper," the patroller said, glancing at the papers without really studying them. "Keep 'em ready for spot checks." After the men rode off, Pike gathered his papers and headed toward the big house. Liddy waited until he was gone, then slipped into the kitchen where cook Mabel was starting dinner preparations. "Child, you look like you've seen a ghost," Mabel said, rolling out biscuit dough on the floured board. "Just thinking about the hymns," Liddy said. She helped carry plates to the dining room, mind working while her hands stayed busy. Wrong seals meant forged papers. Forged papers meant Pike was up to something that wouldn't stand legal scrutiny. But what could a 9-year-old girl do with such knowledge? That night brought rain. It started as scattered drops against the windows, then built to a steady drumming on the roof. By midnight, it was pouring in sheets, and by dawn the yard was flooded ankle-deep. The dogs huddled under the kitchen porch, whimpering when thunder rolled overhead. Liddy stood at the window in her small room behind the kitchen, watching water run in rivers down the glass. Lightning flickered, showing the world outside in brief, silver moments, trees bent by wind, water rising around the quarters, the road to town disappearing under muddy flow. This was more than a storm. This was the kind of weather that washed out bridges and turned creeks into torrents, the kind that kept patrollers close to home and made the main roads impassable. But the back way the route mapped in the hymn might still be clear. Hill country drained different, and the old trails followed high ground. By morning, the situation was clear. The bridge to town was out. The main road was flooded, and Pike was pacing the front porch like a caged animal, staring at the rising water with something close to panic in his pale eyes. "Can't get to the courthouse," he muttered to himself when he thought no one was listening. "Can't file the papers." What papers? Liddy wondered. What was so urgent that Pike needed to reach the courthouse in the middle of a flood? The answer came during lunch, when Dr. Thorne arrived by boat, rowing up to the landing in a small skiff. He'd come to check on Eliza, who'd been having more breathing spells since the dinner party. "Storm's got everyone trapped," he said, warming himself by the parlor fire while Eliza sipped the breathing tonic. "Bridge is gone. Main road's a lake. Won't be passable for days." Pike appeared in the doorway, water dripping from his coat. "Doctor, you come by the hill roads?" "Some of them. Tricky going, but a man who knows the way might make it through." Dr. Thorne studied Pike's face. "You got urgent business in town?" "Might have," Pike said carefully. "Legal matters that won't wait." "Well, if you're fool enough to try it, there's an old trail past Cypress Creek. Starts behind the Quaker meeting house, but you'd need someone who knows the route." Liddy felt her heart jump. The Quaker meeting house that was in the hymn's first verse. And Dr. Thorne was talking about the same route the song had taught her. That evening, as the rain continued and the water rose higher, Pike made his move. Liddy saw him loading supplies into a wagon rope and lanterns, food for a journey, and that leather folder with its forged papers. He was planning to try the hill route in the morning, storm or no storm, but he didn't know the way. That night, Liddy lay awake listening to rain on the roof and wind in the trees. She thought about Josiah, who was supposed to be sold before winter. She thought about Pike's forged papers and the wrong-colored seal. She thought about the route mapped in the hymn and how a person who knew the way might reach the courthouse while everyone else was trapped by flood. Come morning, she'd made her decision. The storm hit hardest just before dawn on Tuesday, wind howling like a living thing and rain driving sideways against the windows. In the grey pre-dawn light, Liddy saw a tree come down across the front drive, its roots torn from the soft earth, branches blocking the main road entirely. Pike's wagon was gone from the barn. She found his tracks in the muddy yard, heading toward the back pasture where the old trail started. He'd left in the dark, trying to beat the worst of the weather. But the tracks were confused, circling back on themselves. He'd gotten lost already. "Liddy!" Mabel called from the kitchen doorway. "Come quick. Mrs. Whitfield's took bad." She ran to the big house, bare feet splashing through puddles. Inside, she found chaos. Eliza was having the worst breathing spell yet, gasping like a landed fish, while Aurelia paced and wrung her hands. "Where's that doctor?" Aurelia demanded. "Where's Pike? This house is falling apart." "Doctor's trapped at the Morrison place," Cook said. "Bridge is out. Pike's gone somewhere with the wagon." Liddy knelt beside Eliza's chair, taking her trembling hands. "Breathe with me," she said, starting the pattern. In, hold, out, hold. But this spell was different, deeper. Eliza's lips were turning blue, and her eyes rolled wild with panic. The breathing pattern wasn't enough. "The tonic?" Liddy said to Mabel. "Fetch the brown bottle." While Mabel ran to get it, Liddy studied the Latin label again. "Respira ordinatim." Breathe regularly. But there was more writing on the back, smaller script she'd never noticed before. "Quinque, gutai, in, aqua, calida." 5 drops in warm water. Dr. Thorne had said 3 drops, but this was the original instruction, and Eliza was worse than she'd ever been. Liddy measured 5 drops into warm water, mixed it careful, and held the cup to Eliza's lips. "Slow sips," she said, "and keep breathing with me." It took an hour, but the spell finally broke. Eliza's color returned, and her breathing steadied. She slumped back in her chair, exhausted but alive. "That child saved your life," Mabel said to Aurelia. "Pure and simple." Aurelia's face was pale with shock. For once, she had nothing to say. That's when the yard dogs started barking, not their usual alarm, but something different. Panicked, yelping that meant they were running from something. Through the window, Liddy saw them splashing across the flooded yard, heading for high ground. "Water's rising," Josiah said from the doorway. He was soaked to the skin, his shirt plastered to his back. "Creeks over its banks. We need to move to higher ground." "Impossible," Aurelia said, finding her voice. "This house has stood for 50 years. "Yes, ma'am," Josiah said respectfully. "But the water don't care about that. Foundation's flooding. Won't be safe much longer." As if to prove his point, muddy water began seeping under the front door, spreading across the polished floor in a dark stain. "Where can we go?" Eliza asked, her voice weak but steady. Josiah looked thoughtful. "Quaker neighbor up the hill has a good loft, Mrs. Hart. She's got space and supplies, if we can get there." "I know the way," Liddy said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her, a small girl with a ribbon at her wrist, claiming she could guide them through a flood. "Child," Aurelia said, "don't be ridiculous." But Eliza was studying Liddy's face. "You know the hill paths?" "Yes, ma'am, from the hymns." It wasn't the full truth, but it was truth enough. The hymn had taught her the route, and she could feel it in her memory like a map drawn in her mind. "We'd best try," Josiah said. "Water's still rising." So they gathered what they could, blankets and food, medicine and matches, the family Bible and the household ledgers. Josiah rigged a sledge from fence boards to carry Eliza when the walking got hard. Mabel packed the tonic bottles, and Cook wrapped leftover bread in oilcloth. Liddy took the lead, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the flooded ground. Behind her came the others, Eliza wrapped in quilts, Josiah pulling the sledge, Aurelia picking her way through the mud with her skirts held high, the household staff following in a ragged line. The path started behind the barn, leading up through pine woods toward the ridge. Water ran everywhere, cascading down the hillsides, pooling in the low places, turning the trail into a stream. But Liddy followed the hymn's directions, counting landmarks as they passed, cypress trees marking the creek crossing, standing stones that might have been boundary markers once, a wagon wheel half buried beside the trail, grown over with vines. "How does she know?" Aurelia asked, breathing hard as they climbed. "Child's got gifts," Mabel said. Always has. The lantern light caught on wet leaves and running water, making everything shimmer like a dream. They walked for 2 hours, resting when Eliza needed breath, pressing on when the rain eased enough to make speed. Josiah kept the sledge steady on the rough ground, and his voice stayed calm and encouraging, even when the path got treacherous. "Almost there," Liddy said, when they reached the ridge. Below them, fog rose from the flooded valley like smoke. Above them, a warm light glowed through the trees. Mrs. Hart's house sat on the highest ground in the county, a neat cabin with a good roof and a loft that could shelter them all. The Quaker woman met them at the door, grey-haired and gentle-faced, with strong hands and a practical manner that cut through Aurelia's objections like a knife through butter. "Come in, all of you," she said. "Storm's no respecter of station. We're all neighbours in weather like this." The loft was warm and dry, with quilts spread on the floor and a small fire burning in the stone hearth. They settled in like travellers in a biblical story, the young widow and the proud sister-in-law, the field hand and the kitchen staff, the small girl with her ribbon and her perfect memory of hymns. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, for the first time in days, there was peace. Liddy sat by the window, watching lightning flicker over the flooded valley. Somewhere down there, Pike was probably still struggling with his forged papers, trying to reach a courthouse that couldn't help him even if he made it. The real business would have to wait until the waters receded, but she'd bought time. Time for Eliza to recover. Time for the truth to surface. Time for the right moment to reveal what she'd learned about seals and papers and the difference between what was legal and what was false. Josiah sat beside her, his back against the wall, watching the storm too. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for knowing the way." "Mama always said songs carry more than music," Liddy replied. "They carry knowledge. What else do they carry?" Liddy touched the ribbon at her wrist, feeling its steady knot. "Hope," she said. "They carry hope." Below them, the flood spread across the valley like a dark sea, but up here in the safety of the loft, with the fire crackling and voices murmuring soft and low, it felt like they were riding out more than just a storm. They were waiting for the waters to recede so the real work could begin. By lamplight that night, while the others slept, Liddy found herself exploring Mrs. Hart's small collection of books. The Quaker woman had given permission with a knowing smile, as if she understood that some children needed words the way others needed food. Most of the books were religious, plain Quaker texts, and a well-worn Bible. But there was also a book of poetry and a collection of folk songs, and at the bottom of the pile, something that made Liddy's heart stop, a family Bible, old and worn, with pages that fell open to familiar spots. The cover was different, plain brown leather instead of the decorated binding in the big house, but the text was the same. She opened it carefully, running her finger down the margins where previous owners had made notes in faded ink. Prayers and reminders, birth dates and death dates, little observations about weather and crops and the passage of time. And there, in the margin beside Leviticus, a note written in graphite pencil, faint but readable in the lamplight. "Josiah, of upright bearing, granted manumission upon my death, witnessed this day by A. Hart." Samuel Whitfield. Liddy's breath caught in her throat. Samuel Whitfield, Eliza's husband, dead since winter. This was his handwriting. She was sure of it. She'd seen his signature on papers in Eliza's desk, a manumission clause hidden in a Bible margin, naming Josiah as freed upon his master's death. But this wasn't the Whitfield family Bible. This was Mrs. Hart's book. How had Samuel Whitfield's note ended up here? The answer came with the sound of footsteps on the ladder. Mrs. Hart climbed into the loft, carrying a cup of warm milk and wearing a knowing expression. "Found something interesting?" she asked softly. "Is this?" Liddy began, then stopped. She wasn't sure how to ask. "Mrs." Hart sat beside her, taking the Bible and turning to the marked page. "Samuel Whitfield was my friend," she said quietly. "One of the few slaveholders in these parts who struggled with his conscience. He came here often to talk, especially near the end. He wrote this here?" "Yes. He wanted to free Josiah, had planned to do it properly, with legal papers, but he took sick, sudden, and there wasn't time. So he wrote it here, where he knew I'd keep it safe. Why didn't you tell someone?" Mrs. Hart's smile was sad and wise. Who would believe a Quaker woman's word about a dead man's intention? The law protects property, child. It doesn't much protect conscience. Liddy stared at the faded graphite words. Here was proof that Josiah should be free, but it was hidden in a book that belonged to a woman whose testimony wouldn't count in any Southern court. There's something else, Mrs. Hart said. She opened the Bible to another page, the inside cover, where family records were usually kept. More handwriting, this time in ink. Copy made, in the Whitfield Family Bible, page 394. Original clause recorded this day, S.W. A copy. Samuel Whitfield had written the manumission clause in two places here, in Mrs. Hart's Bible and in his own family Bible back at the plantation. It's still there? Liddy asked. Should be, if no one's found it and removed it. Samuel was clever about placement, used a page most folks don't read regular. Liddy felt excitement building in her chest. The family Bible was back at the plantation, probably sitting in its usual place on the parlor table, and somewhere in its margins was legal proof that Josiah should be free. But Pike was trying to auction him off based on forged papers, and Aurelia wanted him sold before anyone could discover the truth. What page? Liddy asked. 394. Leviticus, chapter 19. You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. Mrs. Hart's eyes twinkled with what might have been divine humor. Samuel thought the verse was fitting. Liddy memorized the page number, adding it to her growing collection of crucial details. Wrong-colored seals, forged papers, hidden manumission clauses, routes through the back country, all the pieces of a puzzle that could free a good man, if she could figure out how to put them together. When the waters go down, she said, when we get back to the house, be careful, child, Mrs. Hart warned. Truth is a powerful thing, but it can be dangerous too. There are people who profit from keeping it buried. Liddy nodded, understanding. Pike had his forged papers. Aurelia had her prejudices and her authority. Between them, they could make Josiah disappear into the auction system, sold away before winter to some distant plantation where no one would ever think to look for margin notes in a family Bible. But truth had its own power, and sometimes, if you were smart and careful and willing to take the right risks, you could make truth louder than lies. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease. The thunder moved off toward the east, and the rain settled from a driving torrent to a steady patter. By morning, the waters would start to recede. They could go home, and then the real work would begin. Liddy closed the Bible carefully and handed it back to Mrs. Hart. But she kept the memory of those faded graphite words, holding them in her perfect pitch mind like notes in a song she'd never forget. Thank you, she said. For what, child? For keeping truth safe until it was needed. Mrs. Hart smiled and touched the ribbon at Liddy's wrist, a gentle blessing on the small blue thread that somehow seemed to bind all these events together. That's what neighbors are for, she said. The flood left its mark on everything. Liddy stood in the plantation's front yard 3 days later, bare feet squelching in mud that still held the smell of river silt and dead fish. The water had receded, but it had changed the shape of the world. The front drive was washed out. The quarters looked like a line of broken teeth, half the roofs caved in from where trees had fallen. Even the big house bore scars, water stains on the white columns, broken shutters, a front porch that sagged at one corner where the foundation had shifted. But they were all alive, and they'd made it back. Pike hadn't. His wagon was found 2 miles downstream, tangled in a fallen tree with its load of supplies scattered across the muddy ground. No sign of Pike himself, though his hat was caught on a branch and his leather folder was discovered half buried in silt. The forged papers were ruined, ink bleeding into illegible smears. Fool man tried the creek crossing at night, Sheriff Morrison said, standing in the parlor with his boots muddy and his face grim. Current took him. We may never find the body. Aurelia sat in her chair like a queen receiving bad news, her face pale but composed. What of his business affairs? The plantation accounts? That'll take sorting, the sheriff said. Pike kept most records in his head, seems like. What papers survived the flood are mostly ruined. Liddy listened from the corner, where she was polishing the silver tea service, making herself invisible while grown folks talked business. Pike was gone. His forged papers were destroyed. But the manumission clause, if it was still hidden in the family Bible, remained. "Where's that Bible?" she asked Cook Mabel later as they worked to restore order to the flood-damaged kitchen. "Parlor table, same as always," Mabel said. "Amazing what survived when so much got ruined. Books dry as yesterday's biscuit." Liddy found her chance that afternoon while Aurelia napped and Eliza rested in her room, still weak from the ordeal. The parlor was empty, afternoon light slanting through windows that needed washing. The family Bible sat on its usual table, thick as a brick and bound in good leather that had weathered the storm without damage. Page 394, Leviticus, chapter 19. She opened the book carefully, finding the chapter about honest dealing and fair treatment of neighbors. The margins were filled with small notations Samuel Whitfield's handwriting. She was sure of it now. Little observations about weather and crops, Bible study notes, reminders about practical matters. And there, beside verse 11, "You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another." In graphite pencil, so faint she had to angle the page to the light, "Josiah, of upright bearing, granted manumission upon my death, this day witnessed, S.W." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Here it was, proof that Josiah should be free, written in his master's own hand, in the family's own Bible. But as she studied the margin closer, her stomach dropped. The edge of the page was torn not cleanly, but ragged, like someone had ripped out a section in haste. Part of the note was gone, taking the date and witness signature with it. "Find something interesting, child?" Liddy spun around. Aurelia stood in the doorway, still in her dressing gown, eyes sharp as broken glass. Just reading," Liddy stammered, trying to close the Bible casual-like. But Aurelia was already moving, crossing the room with quick steps. She took the book from Liddy's hands and saw the open page, saw the torn margin, saw the faded graphite words. "Well," she said softly, "that explains a great deal." She tore the page stub from the book with one sharp motion, the paper ripping like a small scream. Then she folded it careful and slipped it into her pocket. "Pike found this weeks ago," she said. "Foolish man thought he could manage things quietly, sell the boy before anyone noticed, destroy the evidence, claim ignorance if questions arose." Liddy backed toward the door, but Aurelia's voice stopped her cold. "Now Pike's gone, and the evidence remains, but perhaps that's for the best. This way, I can handle matters properly." "Ma'am?" Aurelia smiled, but it wasn't a kind expression. "That boy will be sold, papers or no papers. This scrap will disappear into a courthouse fire, quite by accident, and if a certain child continues prying into adult business." She didn't finish the threat, didn't need to. "Your family has served this household for 3 generations, Aurelia said instead. "It would be unfortunate if that service ended suddenly. Cook Mabel, for instance. Such a dear woman, but old, and not as useful as she once was. Easy enough to sell her downriver, find younger help." The words hit Liddy like a slap. Threaten her family. Threaten the people she loved. That's how power worked, not just controlling one person, but controlling everyone they cared about. "Do we understand each other?" Aurelia asked. "Yes, ma'am," Liddy whispered. But even as she said it, her mind was working. The torn page was evidence, yes, but it wasn't the only evidence. Mrs. Hart had the copy in her Bible, and the torn edge itself was proof you couldn't rip something out of a book without leaving traces. More than that, Aurelia had made a mistake. She'd confirmed that Pike had been forging papers, that he'd known about the manumission clause, that the whole auction plan was built on lies. Truth, once spoken, had a way of spreading. That evening brought more visitors, neighbors checking on flood damage, the county clerk's deputy making rounds to assess what records might need replacing. Liddy served coffee and listened, filing away every detail. The deputy was young, maybe 25, with ink-stained fingers and a careful manner. His name was Thomas Crane, and he worked under County Clerk Harrison, who was still dealing with flood damage at the courthouse. "Lost half our records," he said, accepting a cup from Liddy with a nod of thanks. "Water got into the basement where we keep the older files. Have to rebuild everything from scratch." "How does one prove ownership?" Aurelia asked, her voice carefully casual. "If the papers are damaged or lost." "Family Bibles, mostly," Crane said. "Wills, purchase receipts, Anything with proper witnesses and seals. Though we've had trouble with forgeries lately, someone's been making false papers with counterfeit seals. Liddy felt her pulse quicken. The wrong-coloured wax, the improper serif on the R. Pike's forged papers. How can you tell? Eliza asked, speaking for the first time since entering the room. Her voice was stronger now, the breathing exercises still helping. Wax colour, for one thing, Crane said. Our seal uses iron blue wax, very specific shade. Forgers tend to use lighter blue, easier to get, but wrong. And the letter forms. Each seal punch has its own characteristics. I could spot our real seal across the room. He pulled a small wax stick from his pocket, deep blue, almost grey. This is the real colour. Most people wouldn't notice the difference, but it's there. Aurelia's face had gone carefully blank, but Liddy saw her hand move toward her pocket, where the torn page was hidden. Fascinating, Aurelia said. And you're certain you could identify a false seal? Absolutely. Been studying them for 3 years now. False papers are a serious crime, could mean prison time for whoever made them. Later, after the deputy left and the household settled for the night, Liddy made her decision. She slipped out of her small room behind the kitchen, bare feet silent on the wet grass. The night was clear and warm, stars brilliant overhead after days of storm clouds. She could hear the river running high in its banks, carrying the last of the floodwater toward the sea. Mrs. Hart's house was a 2-mile walk through the hill country, but Liddy knew the way now. The hymn route, marked by cypress and stone. She carried a small lantern to light the path, and the ribbon at her wrist felt like a talisman against the darkness. Mrs. Hart was awake when she arrived, sitting on her porch with a cup of tea and a look that suggested she'd been expecting company. "Child," she said softly, "what brings you out so late?" Liddy told her everything. The torn page, Aurelia's threats, the deputy's talk about seals and forgeries. Mrs. Hart listened without interruption, her face grave in the lantern light. "So now you have a choice," the Quaker woman said, when Liddy finished. "Keep quiet and protect your family, or speak truth and risk everything." "It's not fair," Liddy said. "Josiah should be free. The law says so. Law and justice aren't always the same thing, child. Sometimes you have to choose between them." Mrs. Hart went inside and returned with her Bible, the one containing Samuel Whitfield's note. She opened it to the marked page, showing Liddy the clear graphite words that matched what had been torn from the family Bible. "This proves what was written," she said. "But as I told you before, my word won't carry weight in court." A Quaker woman's testimony about a dead man's intentions. She shook her head sadly. "But," she continued, "there might be another way." She led Liddy into the house, to a small desk where she kept her correspondence. From a drawer, she produced a piece of paper official-looking, with careful writing and a wax seal at the bottom. "This is a marriage certificate," she said. "Performed here last spring when a young Quaker couple needed witnesses. See the seal? That's from Amos Whitmore's authority as a lay minister. He has the right to perform marriages and certified documents." Liddy studied the seal. It was different from the county clerk's, smaller, simpler, but official-looking. "Amos is Samuel Whitfield's cousin," Mrs. Hart continued. "He was here the day Samuel wrote that note. Witnessed it himself, in fact. Then why didn't he say anything when Pike started the auction plans?" "Because he's been away, up in Pennsylvania, on church business. Only got back yesterday," Mrs. Hart smiled. "But now he's here, and he has the authority to certify copies of the original document." Hope fluttered in Liddy's chest like a caged bird. "You mean?" "I mean we can make this right, child, but it'll take courage, and it'll have to be done public, where Aurelia can't suppress it or make threats." They talked until near dawn, planning how to bring truth into the light. It would be dangerous for Liddy, for her family, for everyone who stood up to Aurelia's authority. But sometimes danger was the price of justice. As the sky began to lighten, Mrs. Hart walked Liddy part of the way home, their voices low in the morning mist. "Remember," she said as they parted at the edge of the woods, "truth spoken in public has power. Lies work best in darkness. Get them into the light and see which one survives." Liddy nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her small shoulders. But also feeling something else, the same strength that had guided them through the flood, the same certainty that had helped her decode the hymn's hidden root. She was small, but she wasn't powerless. She had a perfect memory for details, an ear for truth and falsehood, and a ribbon at her wrist that her mama had taught her to tie strong. It would have to be enough. The next morning brought news that changed everything. County Clerk Harrison had returned to town, his courthouse office restored enough to handle essential business. He'd be holding a public session on the courthouse steps that very afternoon: flood relief, record restoration, and any urgent legal matters that couldn't wait for full repairs. "Perfect opportunity," Aurelia announced over breakfast. "We'll settle Josiah's paperwork today, before any more complications arise." She'd been busy since dawn, writing letters and consulting with the plantation's lawyer, a nervous man named Hartwell, who'd arrived from town with a briefcase full of documents and a manner that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Everything's in order," Hartwell said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "New papers prepared, proper forms filed. Simple sale to settle the estate's debts." But Liddy heard the uncertainty in his voice, saw how he kept glancing at Aurelia for reassurance. This wasn't a lawyer confident in his client's case. This was a man who'd been told what to say and was hoping no one would ask hard questions. By noon, they were all loaded into the repaired wagon, heading for town along roads that were passable but rough from flood damage. Aurelia sat straight-backed and proud, the torn page from the Bible hidden somewhere in her traveling bag. Eliza came too, still pale but determined to see justice done, though she wasn't sure what justice looked like anymore. Josiah rode in the wagon bed, hands free but guarded by two men Aurelia had hired for the occasion. He met Liddy's eyes once during the journey, and she saw resignation there, mixed with a kind of weary dignity. A man who'd hoped for freedom but was prepared to accept whatever came. But hope wasn't finished yet. As they approached the courthouse, Liddy saw a familiar figure standing on the steps, Deputy Clerk Crane, organizing papers and preparing for the afternoon session. And beside him, talking quietly, stood a tall man, in plain clothes, with a gentle face and careful hands. Amos Whitmore, Mrs. Hart's minister friend, Samuel Whitfield's cousin. He was carrying a Bible, not the fancy family version, but a plain working book that looked well used and much loved. When he saw the wagon approach, he nodded to someone in the gathering crowd. "Mrs." Hart stepped forward, her own Bible tucked under her arm, her face calm but determined. She'd come to town for the public session, bringing her evidence and her witness. The trap was set. All that remained was for truth to find its voice. County Clerk Harrison was a big man, with a white beard and eyes that missed very little. He stood on the courthouse steps like a judge holding court, reviewing documents and calling names from his list of business. "Next item," he called. "Estate settlement for the Whitfield plantation, sale of property to cover debts." Aurelia stepped forward with her lawyer, presenting their papers with practiced confidence. The crowd pressed closer, neighbors and strangers, all curious about the proceedings. "Everything appears in order," Harrison said, examining the documents. "Though I notice these are newly prepared copies. What happened to the original papers?" "Flood damage," Lawyer Hartwell said smoothly. "Many records were lost. We've reconstructed from available sources." Harrison nodded, understanding. Half the county was dealing with the same problem. He reached for his stamp to approve the sale. That's when Amos Whitmore stepped forward. "Begging your pardon," he said, his voice carrying despite its gentleness, "but I believe there may be some relevant documents you haven't seen." Harrison paused, stamp in hand. "What sort of documents?" "A manumission clause," Amos said, "written by Samuel Whitfield before his death. I witnessed it myself." A murmur went through the crowd. Aurelia's face went white, then red. "Impossible," she said. "No such document exists." "Actually, Mrs." Hart said, stepping beside Amos. "It does." She opened her Bible to the marked page. "Here's the copy Samuel made in my presence. And here's my own record of the witnessing." Deputy Crane moved closer, studying the page. "This handwriting. It does look like Samuel Whitfield's script. I've seen his signature on other documents." "This is ridiculous," Aurelia snapped. "A Quaker woman's word about a dead man's scribbling? These people are well-known abolitionists. They'd say anything to free a slave." But County Clerk Harrison was examining the Bible page with professional interest. "The graphite inscription does appear authentic, and the date, this would have been within a month of Samuel's death. Even if genuine," Lawyer Hartwell interjected. "A pencil note in a private Bible hardly constitutes a legal document." "No," Harrison agreed. "But it does raise questions about the sale." He looked around the crowd until his eyes found Liddy, standing near the wagon with her small hands clasped tight around her ribbon. "Child, you live in the Whitfield household?" "Yes, sir," Liddy said, her voice small but clear. "Have you seen the family Bible recently?" Aurelia started to object, but Harrison held up his hand. "Yes, sir," Liddy said. "Yesterday. And was there anything unusual about it?" This was the moment. The choice between safety and truth, between protecting her family and protecting what was right. Liddy took a deep breath and made her decision. "Yes, sir," she said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. "Someone tore a page out of the margin, right where it talks about not lying to one another." The crowd stirred, sensing drama. Harrison's eyes sharpened with professional interest. "A torn page, you say? From the same chapter where this alleged manumission note was written?" "Yes, sir. And the person who tore it out, she's got the piece in her bag right now." All eyes turned to Aurelia, whose face had gone rigid with fury. But before she could deny the accusation, Deputy Crane spoke up. "Ma'am," he said to Aurelia, his voice polite but firm, "would you mind showing the contents of your traveling bag?" "This is outrageous," Aurelia sputtered. "To accuse a lady of evidence tampering based on a slave child's word?" "Just a simple verification," Harrison said mildly, "to clear up any confusion." The crowd pressed closer, sensing the drama building. Liddy could feel the weight of dozens of eyes, the tension crackling like lightning before a storm. Aurelia clutched her bag to her chest. "I refuse to be subjected to this humiliation." But that refusal was answer enough. Harrison's face grew stern, and his voice carried new authority. "Ma'am, I'm ordering you to present any documents relating to this case. Failure to comply may result in charges of evidence tampering." The silence stretched like a held breath. Then Aurelia's shoulders sagged, and she reached into her bag with trembling hands. She produced the torn page stub, its ragged edges clear proof of what had been done. Harrison took the paper, holding it up to the light. The crowd could see the torn edge, the faded graphite words, the match to the torn place in Mrs. Hart's Bible. "Well," he said softly, "this does complicate matters." The courthouse steps had become a theater, and every soul in Millfield was watching the final act. County Clerk Harrison held the torn page to the afternoon light, studying the faded graphite words that had survived flood and treachery. The crowd pressed closer, farmers and merchants, wives and children, everyone drawn by the scent of justice being wrestled from the jaws of corruption. "This appears to be authentic," Harrison announced, his voice carrying across the square. "Samuel Whitfield's handwriting, written in the family Bible, witnessed and dated." He looked at Aurelia with eyes gone cold as winter. "And deliberately removed to prevent its discovery." Aurelia's face had crumpled like wet paper. Beside her, Lawyer Hartwell shuffled his documents with the desperate air of a man watching his case collapse. "Even if genuine," Hartwell tried, "the document is incomplete, torn, damaged. Hardly sufficient for legal, but it's not the only copy," Amos Whitmore said, stepping forward with quiet authority. "I witnessed the original notation, and I have the legal standing to certify its authenticity." He opened his ministerial certificate, showing the official seal that gave him authority to witness and certify documents within the county. The same seal that marked his marriage certificates and other legal instruments. "Samuel wrote that manumission clause in my presence," Amos continued, his voice steady and sure. "He was dying, and he wanted to set things right before he passed. Josiah was to be freed upon Samuel's death, with full legal standing." A murmur ran through the crowd. People were nodding, recognizing the truth in Amos's words. They'd known Samuel Whitfield, known him as a man who wrestled with his conscience, who'd grown troubled by slavery in his final years. But Harrison was studying the documents with a lawyer's eye for detail. Even with proper witnessing, there's the matter of estate debts. A slave represents significant value. Can the estate afford to lose that asset? "Actually," said a new voice from the crowd, "that's where things get interesting." Thomas Crane stepped forward, carrying a ledger that looked familiar to Liddy, the plantation account book that Pike had always guarded jealously. But now it lay open in the deputy clerk's hands, its pages exposed to public scrutiny. "I've been examining the estate records," Crane continued, "and there are discrepancies, entries that don't match, debts that seem to have been inflated, sales recorded that never actually occurred." Aurelia went white as chalk. "That's impossible. Pike managed the accounts with perfect accuracy." "Did he?" Crane turned the ledger around, showing the crowd. "Look at these entries. Different ink colors, different handwriting, dates that overlap impossibly. Someone's been falsifying records to make the estate appear more indebted than it actually is." He pointed to specific lines, and even from a distance, Liddy could see the evidence. Pike's careful forgeries, designed to justify selling valuable slaves to pay imaginary debts. "In fact," Crane continued, "according to the legitimate entries, the estate is quite solvent. There's no financial necessity to sell anyone." The crowd began to stir with righteous anger. They'd seen corruption exposed, and they didn't like what they'd witnessed. Voices rose in the square, calls for justice, demands for accountability. But Aurelia wasn't finished fighting. "All of this is speculation and circumstance," she declared, her voice rising to carry over the crowd. "Even if Pike falsified some records, even if Samuel wrote some foolish note in his final illness, the law is clear. I am the heir to this estate, and I have the right to manage its assets as I see fit." She pulled a ring from her finger, a heavy signet bearing the Whitfield family seal. "This ring gives me authority over estate matters. Samuel left it to me as a token of trust. Its seal matches the official documents." Harrison examined the ring, testing its weight in his hand. "The seal does appear authentic," he admitted, "and family rings do carry legal significance." Hope flickered in Aurelia's eyes. She was grasping for any advantage, any legal technicality that might save her position. But Liddy had been watching and listening, her perfect memory cataloguing every detail. And something wasn't right about that ring test. "Sir," she said, her voice small but clear in the sudden quiet. "Sir, could you try the ring in your real seal? The one you use for official business?" Harrison paused, considering. "Why, child?" "Because the ring might fit the shape, but if it's the real family seal, it should make the real color when you press it in wax." The clerk's eyes sharpened with understanding. He reached into his official kit, producing a stick of iron blue wax, the same deep grayish blue that Deputy Crane had shown them days before. "Interesting test," he said, warming the wax over a small flame. "If the ring seal is authentic, it should work with any proper wax." He pressed the ring into the warm iron blue wax, then lifted it carefully. The impression was clear and sharp, the Whitfield family crest, perfectly detailed. But the color was wrong. "Look at that," Harrison said, holding up the fresh seal. "Iron blue wax, but the impression shows light blue, as if the ring itself contains traces of different wax." The crowd leaned forward, straining to see. Even Liddy could make out the difference, the authentic iron blue of the clerk's wax against the paler blue bleeding from the ring itself. "This ring has been used with counterfeit wax," Harrison declared, repeatedly, from the look of it. Light blue wax, the same shade used in the forged documents Pike was carrying. The evidence was overwhelming now. Forged papers, falsified ledgers, evidence tampering, counterfeit seals, a web of corruption that implicated both Pike and Aurelia in systematic fraud. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, his voice growing stern with official authority, "the ring itself appears to be a reproduction. The original Whitfield seal is in the courthouse vault, left there by Samuel himself for safekeeping." He gestured to Deputy Crane, who produced a small wooden box from the courthouse records. Inside, nestled in velvet, was another ring, older, more worn, but bearing the authentic Whitfield seal. "This is the original," Harrison said, "deposited by Samuel Whitfield 6 months before his death, along with instructions that no estate sales should proceed without proper documentation and witness." The crowd erupted in angry voices. They'd watched a systematic attempt to defraud the courts, steal a man's freedom, and cheat creditors through falsified debt records. Even in a society that accepted slavery, such blatant corruption sparked outrage. But through it all, Josiah stood silent and dignified, waiting for the final verdict. Harrison raised his hand for quiet, and gradually the square settled into expectant silence. "Based on the evidence presented," he announced, "I find that Samuel Whitfield did indeed execute a valid manumission for the man known as Josiah, witnessed by Amos Whitmore and properly documented. Furthermore, I find evidence of systematic fraud in the estate records, evidence tampering, and attempted use of counterfeit documents. He turned to face Josiah directly. "Sir, you are hereby declared a free man, with all rights and privileges accorded to free persons under the law of this county." The crowd exploded in cheers and applause. People pressed forward to congratulate Josiah, to shake his hand, to witness this moment of justice done. But Josiah stood frozen, as if the words hadn't quite reached him yet. Then slowly, understanding dawned in his face, and he removed his hat with hands that trembled just slightly. "Thank you," he said to Harrison, then to Amos and Mrs. Hart, then to the crowd in general. "Thank you all." His eyes found Liddy in the press of people, and he stepped toward her, kneeling down to her height. "And thank you, little teacher," he said softly. "You saved more than my freedom today. You saved truth itself." Liddy felt tears on her cheeks, but they were good tears, the kind that came with relief and joy and the satisfaction of seeing justice done. Around them, the crowd was celebrating, but Harrison wasn't finished with official business. He turned to Aurelia with a face like granite. "Ma'am, you'll need to remain in town pending investigation into the fraud charges. Deputy Crane will escort you to suitable accommodations." Aurelia's defiance crumbled entirely. She was no longer the proud, imperious woman who'd humiliated slaves and manipulated legal proceedings. Now she was just someone who'd been caught in lies too big to explain away. As the official crowd began to disperse, Liddy found herself surrounded by neighbors and strangers who wanted to congratulate her, to shake her small hand, to express amazement at her role in exposing the truth. But the person she most wanted to talk to was approaching through the thinning crowd, Eliza Whitfield, pale but steady, using the breathing pattern Liddy had taught her to stay calm. "Liddy," Eliza said, taking her hands, "can you forgive me?" "Ma'am? For not being stronger, for not standing up to Aurelia sooner, for almost letting this injustice happen." Liddy looked up into Eliza's tired eyes and saw genuine remorse there, mixed with a new kind of determination. "You stood up when it mattered," Liddy said simply. "You came here today. You let the truth be told." Eliza nodded, tears threatening. "Things are going to change at the plantation. No more sales without consent. Fair wages for all work. And that family Bible, it's going to live in the chapel from now on, where everyone can see it and remember what justice looks like." As the afternoon sun slanted low across the courthouse square, the last of the crowd began to disperse. But a small group remained: Liddy and Eliza, Josiah and Mrs. Hart, Amos Whitmore, and even Deputy Crane, all of them bound together by the events they'd shared. "What comes next?" Eliza asked Josiah. "You're free now. You can go anywhere, do anything." Josiah was quiet for a long moment, looking out toward the river that had brought flood and change to all their lives. "I'd like to work the river," he said finally. "Paid work, fair wages. Until I can find my mother, she was sold south when I was young. Maybe now I can track her down, bring her home." "The river work is yours," Eliza said immediately. "And any help we can give with finding your family." Mrs. Hart approached them as they prepared to leave, carrying her Bible and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd seen justice done. "Child," she said to Liddy, "you did something remarkable today. You held truth steady when lies were trying to drown it." Liddy touched the ribbon at her wrist, feeling its familiar comfort. "Mama always said truth wants to be told. Sometimes it just needs someone to give it voice." "Well said," Mrs. Hart smiled. "And what about you? What do you want now?" Liddy considered the question seriously. She was still enslaved, still bound to the plantation, still subject to laws that didn't recognize her full humanity. But something had changed today. She'd proven that intelligence and courage could overcome corruption, that a small voice could speak truth loud enough to be heard. "I want to learn more," she said finally. "Read more books. Understand more about how laws work, how justice happens. Maybe help other folks find their voices." "I think that can be arranged," Eliza said, "starting with proper schooling. No reason a child with your gifts shouldn't have every educational opportunity we can provide." As they prepared for the journey home, Josiah approached the small chapel that stood beside the courthouse, a simple building where traveling ministers held services when they passed through town. "Mind if we stop here first?" he asked. "Feel like I ought to give thanks properly." They gathered in the chapel's modest interior, afternoon light streaming through plain windows onto wooden benches worn smooth by years of use. Liddy sat between Eliza and Mrs. Hart, watching as Josiah stood before the simple altar. "Don't rightly know the words," he said softly, "but I'm grateful. For freedom, for friends, for truth that wouldn't stay buried." Liddy began to hum, not the dog-quieting tune from that morning weeks ago, but something new. A melody that seemed to rise from the day's events, carrying hope and resolution and the promise of better things to come. One by one, the others joined their voices to hers. Mrs. Hart's clear alto, Eliza's tentative but strengthening soprano, Josiah's warm baritone, even Deputy Crane's uncertain bass. The chapel filled with harmony, with the sound of different voices finding common ground in song. Outside, the sun was setting over the river valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The floodwaters were gone, leaving the land cleaner somehow, ready for new growth. As they prepared to leave the chapel, Liddy approached the simple wooden rail that separated the congregation from the altar. She untied the ribbon from her wrist, the pale blue silk that had been her mother's gift, her constant companion through all the day's trials. Carefully, she tied it to the rail, leaving one bright thread fluttering in the evening breeze that stirred through the open windows. "Why?" Mrs. Hart asked gently. "Promise," Liddy said simply, "that I'll remember today. Remember how truth sounds when it finally gets to speak." They walked out into the gathering dusk, leaving the ribbon behind as a marker of change, a symbol of hope, a reminder that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. As they climbed into the wagon for the journey home, Liddy looked back once at the chapel windows glowing warm in the twilight. Inside, her ribbon moved gently in the evening air, a pale blue flag of victory fluttering in the peace. The road ahead was uncertain. There would be more challenges, more injustices to face, more truths that needed voices to speak them. But tonight, in this moment, justice had been done, and freedom had been won. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, the dogs were sleeping quiet and untroubled, no longer needing a child's song to calm their restless spirits.